Hello and welcome to Varn blog. And today we talk about my favorite post-Marxist bête noire, Jean Baudrillard, and his 2010 book, The Agony of Power. Baudrillard is interesting to me for a variety of reasons. I've been told I've been unfair to him before. I've also been told that I've been too kind, that I haven't seen his essential conservatism or his nihilism. And to some degree, these all might be true. I've been working my way through Baudrillard's corpus and trying to understand his frustration with Marxism that emerged in the 70s and 80s, why he felt critical of it, why he felt like its power had been denuded from it. And the scandals he caused in the aughts, I think we've largely forgotten them, but I remember quite a many liberals going after Baudrillard, from Raymond Tallis, a philosopher that I often like in other scenarios, to Richard Rowland in The Seduction of a Reason, basically saying that Baudrillard thought 9/11 was a good idea. But Baudrillard is interesting for the Marxists because it often rhymes with what we think, but isn't quite the same. Now, what do Marxists think? Who knows these days? It's hard to tell. I take the gambit on that. We'd have to clarify and debate and battle. But let's deal with Baudrillard as it is here and really get into it. Some people call this the most blackpilling of his books, and it's from 2010, The Agony of Power. This is from the essay called From Dominion to Hegemony. And I'm going to read a lot of it, so bear with me. What other features distinguishes hegemony from pure and simple domination is the coming of the fundamental event, simulacra and simulation. And this, a side note, is Baudrillard's like one neat trick that he does after the 70s. Hegemony works through a general masquerade. It relies on excessive use of every sign and obscenity, the way it mocks its own values and challenges the rest of the world by its cynicism. Carnivalization. Classical historical domination imposed a system of positive values, displaying them as well as defending these values. Contemporary hegemony, on the other hand, relies on the symbolic liquidation of every possible value. The terms simulacrum, simulation, and virtual summarize this liquidation, and every signification is eliminated in its own sign. And the profusion of signs parodies a by now unattainable reality. This is a total masquerade in which domination itself is engulfed. Power is only the parody of the signs of power, just as war is only the parody of the signs of war, including technology. Masquerade of war, masquerade of power. We cannot, therefore, speak of hegemony of the masquerade and the masquerade of hegemony. All meaning is abolished in its own sign, and the profusion of signs parodies now an undiscoverable reality. Now, Baudrillard's poetic license and playing with post-Husserlian linguistics aside, and I think it is fair to critique him on that kind of overstatement, there is a sense in which all we all have now is meta-references and negativity and crisis, and positive values are harder and harder for anyone to defend, even people who ostensibly believe in a positive worldview, like, say, the religious. What did the religious do? Did they propose their own moral way of life? No, nor do they even hold their constituencies to them anymore. Don't believe me? Go to a megachurch. What we do see, however, is they can oppose things as a threat to their way of life, but they cannot argue for their way of life anymore. Now, that is interesting. And it's interesting to think about why that is. What is the scientific reason for that? Am I overstating as much as Baudrillard? It seems like Baudrillard is using extreme hyperbole to make a point that does seem to ring somewhat true. But we'd have to really spend some time in some social sciences to nail it down and say it with any real authority. Let us continue. Domination and hegemony are separated by the liquidation of reality. The superfast eruption of late of a global principle of simulation, a global hold by the virtual. Globalization is the hegemony of global power and can only occur in the framework of the virtual and the networks, the hegemony that comes from the signs emptied of their substance. Basically, Baudrillard is describing the memification of reality. The entire Western masquerade relies on the cannibalization of reality by signs, or of a culture by itself. I use cannibalize here in the derivative sense of cannibalizing a car, using its spare parts. Cannibalizing a culture, as we do today, means tinkering with its values like spare parts, in so much that the entire system is out of order. The distinction between domination and hegemony is crucial. It determines the forms of resistance appropriate for each and the various ways in which the present situation could evolve. One doesn't respond to hegemony and domination in the same way. The strategy should not be confused. And on that, I agree with him. In fact, in the face of this hegemony, the work of the negative, the work of critical thought, of the relationship of forces against oppression, or of radical subjectivity against alienation, all this has virtually become obsolete. It has become obvious that, thanks to the twists and turns of cynical reason, are the ruses of history, this new hegemonic configuration, which no longer the hegemony of capital. I don't know what he means by that. This is one of the things about Baudrillard. They'll make bold assertions like the hegemony configuration, which is no longer the hegemony of capital. Capitalism seems to be functioning in our society just fine, my friend. But whatever. Has absorbed the negativity as a way of regaining the initiative. Caught in the vast Stockholm syndrome, the alienated, the oppressed, and the colonized are siding with the system that holds them hostage. This way, I do see a little bit of this, of what Baudrillard is getting at, the way in which so many people who suppose the system actually support the very state that maintains and manages the capitalism that they don't want. And they can't propose a counter state or another mechanism or even a counter institution in which to compete with and integrate into and take over the state. It remains actually within the viable systems of the state itself. In America, the Democratic Party. In the UK, the Labour Party, etc. They are now annexed, in the literal sense, prisoners of the new nexus of the network connected for better or worse. Power has ransacked all the strategies of simulation, parody, irony, and self-mockery, leaving the left with only a phantom of the truth. The famous slogan of the Banque Nationale de Paris in the 1970s comes to mind: "Your money interests me." This statement encapsulates the ignominy of capital far better than any critical analysis. Denouncing capital and all banking mechanisms was nothing new. The scandalous feature was that the banker himself has said it. Truth coming from the mouth of evil, capitalized. It wasn't a denunciation, a critical analysis. It came from the dominant power, enjoyed complete immunity. It could admit its crime in broad daylight. And indeed, there is a certain commodification of dissent that capital has done in the later half of the 20th century. In the 21st, too. People sell you your analysis. Whole cottage industries emerge out of it. And you are participating in one, even by watching this unmonetized video. The recent profession of faith in a similar vein came from Patrick Lelay, CEO of TF1, the French television channel. Let's be realistic. The job of TF1 is to help Coca-Cola sell its products. For the advertising campaign to work properly, the viewers' brains have to be accessible. The goal of our program is to make them available by entertaining them, relaxing them between the two messages. What we sell to Coca-Cola is relaxed brain time. Nothing is harder than getting them to open up. We should pay our respect to this amazing admission and professional cynicism. It is widely shared as the following slogan for Bourse Telecom testifies: money has no sex, but it will reproduce. And it could be condemned for the same reason as it has been by all the fine minds. This is not the real problem. Even those who contemned Lelay's shocking statement were fascinated by its insolence. Doesn't this shameless flippancy manifest a greater freedom than the stonewalling of critical consternation? But this is the question. How could the truth not be listed by an arrogant discourse that gets the upper hand by shortcutting any critique? the critique's already admitted to, you can't level it. Technocratic cynicism is not scandalous per se, but by the way it breaks the fundamental rule of our social and political game. Corruption for some and protesting evil for others. If the corrupt have no respect for this protocol and show their hand without sparing us their hypocrisy, then the ritual mechanism of the enunciation goes haywire. Who are you going to virtual signal against? I mean, Baudrillard's got a point there. Baudrillard. The privilege of telling the truth eludes our grasp, and in the face of the capital unveiled by capitalists even. In fact, Lillet takes away the only power we have left. He steals our denunciation. This is the real scandal. Otherwise, how can you explain the general outrage when he revealed an otherwise open secret? Instead of denouncing evil from the position of the good, the eternal moral position, he expresses evil from the position of evil. Is this the best way to say it? But it remains inadmissible. The truth must be on the side of good. There can be no intelligence onto the side of evil. Yet all those who undo themselves with arrogance, Le Pen, cynicism, Lillet, pornography, Abu Ghraib, mythomania, Mary L., unmask the truth of the system in which their abuse of it. The effects are both fascinating and revolting. They are much more effective than conventional critiques. A bitter truth. Radicalness is on the side of the intelligence of evil. Now, one of the things that is frustrating about Baudrillard is his use of metaphysical language while totally denuding metaphysical language. So he both wants to use metaphysical language in his critique of good and evil, but also not admit to it. Everything's void and nothing. And that's a very frustrating thing with generally Baudrillard, because he both gives you a moralistic critique and takes it away. Thus, many of the points he makes in here that are good, I think, are better made by more conventional understandings in political economy. But let's continue. Critical intelligence no longer measures up to the collapse of reality as it passes into total reality. The truth or the inhumanity of the situation can only be revealed from the inside, voluntarily or involuntarily, by the agents of embezzlement of reality. Only evil can speak evil now. Evil is a ventriloquist. Critical intelligence is left to jump over its own shadow. Even in its radicalness, it remains pious and denunciatory. The curse of critical discourse is to reconcile itself secretly with those it criticizes by denouncing them, and I am well aware what I'm saying belongs to this discourse. Denunciation will never have the shocking frankness of unscrupulous discourse, which I actually agree with Baudrillard about. We must look to the side effect of evil for the clearest indications of the harshest reality. Only those who show no concern for the contradiction or critical consternation in their acts and discourse can, by their very means, shed full light without remorse or ambiguity on the absurd and extravagant character of the state of things through the play of objective irony. What is happening in critical thought, the thought of the Enlightenment and of the Revolution, the thought that drove the analysis of the capital, merchandise, and spectacle to the 19th and 20th centuries, is what happened before the religious, ethnic, and linguistic phenomena. We are presently witnessing the formal renewal, but without any of their original substance. The religious revival is epigonal and has nothing to do with the fervor of past centuries. It proposes the dilution of faith as symbolic organization, the disappearance of transcendence, and maybe even the death of God. It is a specific product of a disenchanted situation of loss where everything that disappears is artificially revived. It is kind of true. Baudrillard isn't wrong, for example, that fundamentalism was actually the last of the arrival of responses to religious problems of Protestantism in the 19th century. The Tractarian movement and the fundamentalist movement and the evangelical movement are actually all latecomers. They were responses to the liberalization of mainline Protestantism. But they were kind of dependent on opposition to things that were better established. I could go into this. I've talked a lot about the history of Christianity before. If you want to check out me talking about it, I do a discussion of the scandal of the evangelical mind and sectarian view many years ago. You can look it up and find it. I might even put a link in the show notes for you. Current critical thought continues along its trajectory, but it is no longer the critical thought of the Enlightenment and modernity, which has its own object and their own energy. It is an epiphenomenon of a world where there is nothing left to analyze in the hopes of subverting it. This thought is no longer current because we are no longer in a critical situation like the historical domination of capital. He's been saying that capital domination is over, which I find interesting. This is a theme from people from the 1950s up until about the recession, and it seems like Baudrillard is not dealing with the recession much in this book, even though he wrote it during that time period. This is the thought that is no longer current because we are no longer in a critical situation, like the historical domination of capital. We had entered the hegemonic form of total reality, the closed-circuit global power that has even captured the negative. All that is left today is a specific product of the posthumous situation where it no longer has historical reason to exist or any effectiveness. I don't know. I think COVID and the various wars have broken out since this book was written pretty much indicate that Baudrillard is wrong about that. Just a thing. Yet it is more prominent. The critique of alienation and spectacle has blossomed and spread to the point it has become the most common vulgate because only discourse of consolation we have. It's almost like he's talking about the Matrix movies. But its tone has changed. It has become more melancholy as a subversion, and transgression has lost popularity today. Transgression has lost popularity. 3 dimensions from the passage from domination to hegemony. Its perilous triple jump, a 3-part sacrifice. Capital surpasses itself and turns against itself in the sacrifice of value, the economic illusion. Power turns against itself in the sacrifice of representation, the democratic illusion, and the entire system turns against itself in the sacrifice of reality, the metaphysical illusion. All 3 jump over their shadow. The shadow of capital is value. The shadow of power is representation. The shadow of the system is reality. They all move beyond value, representation, and reality in a hyperspace that is no longer economic, political, or real, but rather hegemonic sphere. I have no idea what that means. Capital is both the total realization of value and its liquidation. Power is now the final form of representation. It represents only itself. The system is the total version of the real, and at the same time its liquidation through the virtual. This is the hegemonic forms, the economic illusion. In any event, the question of capital must be reconfigured. Does something like capital still exist? And if there is a crisis, where is the essence of this crisis? We must try to pass through the looking glass beyond the mirror of production. Does exploitation still exist? Can we talk about alienation? Have we become the hostages, not the slaves, but the hostages of a global market under the definition of the sign of globalization? But can we still talk of a market? Hasn't capitalism reached the point of destroying the conditions of its own existence? ? One problem of the generalized exchange in that both the market is both the ideal and its strategic location. It may be the fatal destiny of capital to go to the limit of exchange, to the total consumption of reality. Its historical and Marxist definition, capitalism pride over multiplication of exchanges in the name of value. The market obeys the law of value and equivalency. The limit here is the limit of classic capitalism. The crisis of capital can be resolved by regulating value. There is no longer true for financial flows and international speculation that far surpass the laws of the market. Can we even still speak of capital? I think financial speculation actually is still within the laws of the market. And actually 2007 was a good example of it. But that's just me. Do we keep the term and concept, therefore acknowledge the existential strategy that pushes beyond its own limits into the whirlwind of exchanges where capital loses its very essence and the essence of the market and self-destructs an unbridled circulation that brings the very concept of exchange to an end? We're still buying stuff, Baudrillard. It's okay. Or do we consider that it is no longer capital at all, but something radically different, an exchange that is only general but total, completely free from value in markets? An exchange, having lost its rational principle, the principle of value, becomes integral, just as reality, having lost its reality principle, becomes integral reality, from which there's no salvation. I have no idea what he means. I'm not going to lie. This is the paradox of Baudrillard. Some of his things make a lot of sense, and then you read the next thing, and there's this grand assertion that seems to be not only true, it literally is begging the question. And I mean that in the strict sense, like it is asking a question in which if you answer him, you are presumed to agree with him, and if you don't answer him, you can't really answer and go into the next part of the question. In this light, capital in its historical form appears to be a lesser evil. In relation to the virtual universe, reality appears to be the lesser evil. In view of hegemony, domination itself appears to be less evil. Take the example of the web, the internet, networks, blogs, etc. It's all free, liberally deployed without economic constraints beyond markets in a frenzy of total communication. Oh, Baudrillard, if you'd only lived 5 more fucking years, you'd have known how false that was. Because during the time period in which you were talking about, the use of debt instruments was making it where they were going to marketize all that, and it wasn't free anymore. Or in so much that it is free, it's free in a very limited and capricious sense. In the same way that television is free. It's free because it sells you ads. And that was not the case in 2010, but that was a bait and switch, my friend. Capital reasserted itself. That you didn't see, Baudrillard. We find ourselves wanting it all to be subject to the law of value taken in by him by capitalist power to slow its exponential development, to escape the ecstasy of free, secular, and obligatory communication, because it is leading to the dictatorship of forced exchange, but no one will escape. Oh, I don't know. Both Patreon and Substack proved that blogs and free stuff could be commoditized, even commoditized for people who do it for free. It's a weird thing, Baudrillard. Money still wins. The next stage, which will be seen in these mysterious free networks, is much worse than anything that was stigmatized as the mercantilization of exchange, where everything is assigned a price in a market. Oh, never mind, Baudrillard, you do see it. This influence, not strictly speaking the influence of a person, a capitalist power, or any political power, is the tendency of a total, integral, free exchange, or universal lying, universal connection, capital, markets, surplus value, merchandise, and prices seem the lesser evil, or the production against something worse. The virtual dimension of hegemony is different than the domination of capital, and it's a different dimension of power in a strictly political definition. Saying this, actually, right after the economic downturn does seem to be Baudrillard, almost senility. You make a lot of good points, but that point is nonsense. The democratic illusion. One might wonder, however, if hegemony is the direct continuation or perpetuation of domination. Is it the same form deployed to its ultimate consequence, or is there a moment where there is a shift to a non-critical form beyond the internal crises, but not exempt from the external catastrophes or self-delusion through saturation, like any system at the limits of its possibilities, where total, instantaneous, perpetual communication is unthinkable and, in any case, intolerable. Hegemony corresponds to a phase of the saturation of power, political, financial, military, but cultural, even cultural power. It pushes beyond its own logic, but unable to accomplish the possibilities fully, a dire fate indeed, the story of an umbrella. Maybe the dire fate of realizing the possibilities is fully the fate of humankind. Yet any action that tries to slow capital or power, that tries to keep them from accomplishing all of their possibilities in their last hope, the last chance to survive just short of their end. And if we let them, they will rush headlong to their end, which will take us with them. Get to the point, Baudrillard. Is it better to let them do it, or to follow them to their fatal penchant for self-destruction through the saturation and ultra-realization, or is it better to slow down to avoid total disaster? Seems like it's better to slow down to avoid total disaster. I don't know why that's a hard choice. This is a paradox we confront in the paroxysm of power. And again, the same global, universal problem faces humanity in its hyper-electric fate when it rushes to its end because it's too successful, technologically, sexually, demographically, etc. It all depends on your idea of power. If you presuppose that intelligence or imagination holds power, then the persistence of stupidity, or at least the permanent absence of imagination from power, is inexplainable. Unless you also suppose the general disposition amongst people to delegate their sovereignty to the most inoffensive, least imaginative of their fellow citizens, a mélange that pushes people to elect the most nearsighted, corrupt person out of the secret delight in seeing the stupidity and corruption of those in power. I mean, that may explain some recent politicians, honestly. Both Biden and Trump seem to be different sides of that coin, but we'll continue. Especially in times of trouble, people still vote massively for the candidate who has not asked them to think. It is silent conjuration, analogous to political spirits, the conspiracy of art in another domain. We abandon the democratic illusion of imagination, of intelligence and power that comes from the depths of Enlightenment ideology. The naive utopias in the 1960s must be revised. Imagination and power. Take your dreams for reality. No limits to pleasure. All of these slogans were realized and hyper-realized in the development of the system. If we remove the moral utopia of power, power as it should be in the eyes of those who reject it, if we hypothesize that power only lives through the parody or simulations of representation and is defined by society that manipulates it, if we accept the hypothesis that power is an ectoplasmic yet indispensable function, that people like Bush or Schwarzenegger fill the roles perfectly. Not that a country or a people has leaders it deserves, but that its leaders are the emanations of global power. The political structure of the United States has direct correlation to global domination. Bush leads the U.S. in the same way those who exercise global hegemony over the rest of the planet. We could even say that hegemony of global power resembles the absolute privilege of the human species over all other species. You actually do have a point there, Baudrillard. There is therefore no reason to think of an alternative. Power itself must be abolished, not solely in the refusal to be dominated, which is the heart of all traditional struggle, but also just as violently in the refusal to dominate. If the refusal to dominate had the same violence and the same energy as the refusal to be dominated, the dream of revolution would have disappeared long ago. Intelligence cannot and can never be in power because intelligence consists of this double refusal. If I think that there were a few people without any power in the world, I would know that all is not lost. Elias Kennedy. The metaphysical illusion. The reabsorption of the critical negativity is echoed by an even more radical form of denial, the denial of reality. And simulation move beyond the true and false through parody, masquerade, derision to form an immense enterprise of deterrence from every historical reference, from all reality and passes into signs. The strategy of destabilization, of discrediting, of divestment from reality in the form of parody, mockery, and masquerade becomes the very principle of government. It also the depreciation of all value. The question is no longer of a power or a political power connected from history to forms, representation, to contradictions and critical alternatives. Representation has lost its principle, and the democratic illusion is complete. Not much by the violation of rights, but as much as a simulation of values and of general uncertainty and a derealization of all reality. Everyone's caught in the signs of power that occupy the entire space, and that is shared by everyone communally. Take, for example, the resigned, embarrassed complicity in the rigged workings of the political sphere and polls. Yeah, but also, I know. From there, the system works exponentially, not starting from value, but from liquidation of value, not through representation, but through the liquidization of representation, not from reality, but from the liquidation of reality. Everything in the name of which dominates has exercises terminated, sacrifice, which will be logically held to the end of domination. This indeed is the case, but not for the sake of hegemony. The system doesn't care a fig for laws. It unleashes deregulation in every domain. Deregulation of the value of speculation. Deregulation of representation in the various works of manipulation and parallel networks. Deregulation of reality through information, the media, and virtual reality. From that point on, total immunity. No one can longer counter the system in the name of one's own principles, since the system has abolished them. This is the end of all critical negativity, closure of every account and of all history, the reign of hegemony. On the contrary, since it's no longer regulated by representation and in its own concept, an image of itself, the system succumbs to the final temptation. It becomes hypersensitive to its own final conditions and casts itself beyond its own end according to the inflexible decree of the race of reality. The most serious of all forms of self-denial, not only economically or politically, but metaphysically, is the denial of reality. This immense enterprise of deterrence from the very historical reference, the strategy of discrediting, of divesting from reality, in the form of parody, mockery, and masquerade becomes the very principle of government. The new strategy, and it is truly a mutation, is the self-emulation of value, of every system of value, of self-denial, indifference, rejection, nullity, as a triumphant command. I'm going to stop there because I've read a lot. I don't want to get in trouble for reading you too much of a book. But this brings us to paradox of Baudrillard. Baudrillard seems to have his finger on the pulse of certain things, but then he extrapolates to such an extreme degree that he seems to miss trends in the immediate future, or even trends that are beginning when he's writing. In 2010, Facebook and blogs had not yet figured out how to marketize. And when they did, blogs died and Facebook got a lot less useful. People remained for a long time, but it lost its critical value amongst the young. TikTok is highly commodified. And in fact, the advertising money that runs through these things leads people to believe that they can make a living as people just peddling things into nothing. It is the utter expansion and inflation of the category of representation, and on that Baudrillard has a point, but on that as somehow removed from capital, he absolutely does not. And these functions are beginning to meet real material limits. Those material limits come from the fact that they were never that profitable when faced with the constraints of high debt costs. So Baudrillard, in all of his abstract analysis, is not looking at the material reality around him, at least not in this book. I don't say this to discredit Baudrillard. I think Baudrillard is one of the most interesting of the post-Marxists, but there's a problem here, and the problem becomes when you just try to apply it consistently to what happened just 10 years from this book. Think about everything from 2015 to 2020. It doesn't look like the world that Baudrillard is describing at the end of history at all. The end of all representation liquidating itself in its own negation. I mean, what Baudrillard is engaging in the agony and power is almost like dark Fukuyama thought. And yet he does hit on some things that are eerie and correct. But why are they correct? What is he seeing? He keeps on saying that capital is no longer what is driving the system. And I guess he presages a lot of the techno-neo-feudalist thinking that we started seeing emerging in 2017 and 18. But yet capital still seems to be the hard limit of everything. And if you don't believe me, as we try to renationalize supply chains and undo our cloud-like production, which were all material things in the first place, that seems to be what Baudrillard is missing. Every bit of this required real infrastructure to build, real power to use, real domination and real exploitation to maintain. And while hegemony, this way of abstractifying this cultural power and limiting us all on commenting on it all the time, may be a real feature of that, the two pillars that we talked about are still very, very real and very instantiated. And if you don't believe me, see what happens to this internet network when we don't have power. Or things get too hot to run the power, or we run out of water to cool the systems down, etc. You do not escape the real. The virtual still requires a shit ton of physical energy. We must not give in to this kind of extreme logic, I think. Baudrillard shows you a lot of the problems of the systemic thinking, but also in just taking it at face value. I mean, it would be great if power itself to be abolished. After all, a classless society is a society where not just is no one resisting being dominated, is everyone resisting being dominated. But hopefully, through that resistance, also doesn't want to dominate. Yeah, and that's great. But you can't do that by such abstractions. Weirdly, somehow I can't tell if this is a moralistic book or a nihilistic one. And in either way, there seems to be a limitation. We're going to continue dealing with Baudrillard because I think there's a whole lot of good and bad in him to unpack. And this is a primary example. There's a lot of good points he makes and a lot of terrible ones. If you like this kind of philosophical investigation, also discussions of all kinds of other things, recent analysis of trends that I do, my job and my mission is to educate. And I try to make as much of it as free as possible. If you would like to support me doing that, you can sign up at the Patreon. If you don't have the money or you don't think it's worth it, or maybe not, I could use some more subscribers. So share and share alike, hit the bell and subscribe. The production values are going to remain streamer-tastic, but I promise you that you'll get the value of the ideas. because I'm not charging you anything unless you want to pay it. Have a great day. And don't let the black pill taint your red.